All right, so Ruth chapter 3, we read verses 1 through 5. Okay, 1 through 5, there was a lot happening. Naomi comes to Ruth and gives her some godly, elderly wisdom. And one of the things we left off with last week was that we need to respect our elders. But also, we need to be very mindful of those who are older than us in the Lord, that they have wisdom. They have wisdom beyond our years. Right? And so we need to be mindful of that, listen to that, glean from the things that they say to us, because, again, they've been there, they've done that, the Lord has instructed them, the Lord has corrected them. It's amazing. And I know at this age, that's really hard to understand. There is something that God has done within this age where we just don't oftentimes understand that those who are older than us actually have some wisdom. Right? We think, well, when they're older, well, they're actually dumber, right? Like, they don't know what I know. We're know-it-alls when we're 14, 15, 16 years old. And in reality hits in, the older you get, you realize, man, I did not know that much. And so it's really important that we glean from them. And the older people, they want to pour into us. I mean, it's commanded and instructed to them in Titus chapter 2 for the older men to pour into the younger men, for the older women to pour into the younger women. And so I'll just encourage you to listen to them when they speak. And so she speaks to Ruth and gives her some really good advice. In our age, in our time, we're thinking this is some weird advice, right? Because what was her advice?
Take the sandals off.
Yeah. Well, before we get there, some actually good advice. She's like, maybe you should shower, take a bath, right? Put some perfume on. That doesn't hurt, right, guys? And then put a nice dress on, right? Now, what was the significance of this dress?
We'll show that she was
Yeah. Kind of like, okay, like no longer am I wearing my, sweatpants and my old shirt, and, I got my hair up in a bun. Like, no, I'm actually going to make myself presentable. But the thing is, in this culture, it wasn't just that. She wasn't just wearing sweatpants. She was wearing a dark dress. She was wearing dark clothes, right, to signify that she was a widow. And so at this point, she's now changing and transitioning her attire to reveal to Boaz that she is interested, right? That she's available. So she puts on a nice dress that's now a lighter color for that very reason. And she says, go to the threshing floor, because that's where Boaz is, right? He's a faithful guy. He's a hard worker. She knows that's where he's going to be. And she says, when you go there, wait until he's done eating and drinking. Right? Just some practical wisdom there. Wait till he's done eating and drinking, and when he lies down, go and uncover his feet. Okay? Uncover his feet. Really interesting. All right, now, this is not advice we should take today. This is unique to Ruth in this time. Okay? This is not, dating advice, ladies. Like, don't take this advice and try to imitate this today. And so she says at the very end, all that you say to me, I will do. We know Ruth is very, very humble. Right? She's teachable. That is a wonderful and beautiful thing within any single person, whether you're 12 years old, 18 years old, or 45 years old. Anyone who is teachable, God can use. Right? God can use the humble. Right? He can use the humble. But he opposes who? The proud. Right? And so when you're prideful, you're not teachable because you think you're a know-it-all. Right? But when you're humble, the Lord can really pour into you and use you. And we see this example here with Ruth, as she says, all that you say to me, I will do. So verse 6, let's go ahead and read. It says, so she went down to the threshing floor, and she did according to all that her mother-in-law instructed her. I love that, right? It's yes, I will do what she just told me to do. She says it verbally, but then she actually backs it up with her actions, right? She's faithful to do what she was instructed to do, and we're going to see that she's going to be completely blessed by this. And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Now it happened at midnight that the man was startled, and he turned himself, and there a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, who are you? So she answered, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative, or a kinsman redeemer. Then he said, blessed are you, the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, and that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear, for I will do for you all that you request. For all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. Now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Ooh, there's a twist here. Stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good. Let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, and she arose before one could recognize another. Then he said, do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And also he said, bring the shawl that is on you and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 ephahs of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, is that you, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. And she said, these 6 ephahs of barley he gave me, for he said to me, do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Then she said, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out, for the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day. So we get a picture now of what transpired after the instruction of Naomi, but now we're left with another cliffhanger. What's going to be the response? Because there was a twist in all of this, right? She makes herself available to Boaz, but Boaz, reminds her or lets her know at this point that there's actually someone who's closer. And by law, the one who is closer gets, the first right of refusal. So it's up to him whether he's going to be the kinsman redeemer or not. And if he is, then you have to go that route with that man, right? So he's adhering, right, to God's law more than what he in his heart desires. Isn't that interesting? And that's really important for us to understand, because here's this man who has an interest in Ruth. Here's this woman who has an interest in this man. Like, you would think this is ideal, right? Forget what the law is. Forget what God has designed. They're perfect for each other. They like each other. They love each other. But here we see that they both submit ultimately to God's word rather than their desires. It's God's will over our will. But do you know what's awesome? We're going to see in the end, spoiler, is that God is going to give them the desire of their heart. And I truly believe it's because they're walking in the will of God and they're doing what is right in God's eyes, that they're doing things well. Like, God genuinely blesses us when we do what he's commanded us to do, right? Not always the blessings that we think that the world wants, a pay raise and this and that. I mean, sometimes God does that, but he blesses us in other ways. And so here they're going to get blessed because they do exactly what God calls them to do, but they are willing to submit to God's law and God's word first and foremost, no matter the result. No matter if this other guy says, yeah, I'll do it. I'll take on that responsibility of being the kinsman redeemer. And now Ruth has to marry then this guy who she doesn't even know, right? So in verse 6, as she goes to the threshing floor, she does what's instructed of her. And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the heap of the grain. And so Boaz is sleeping here because that's where he's working, but it's also another reason. It's because in this day, in the day of Judges, there was a lot of instability politically, socially. There was a lot of, kind of like what we're going through now, where people are just going to Walgreens and Target and just taking whatever they want, right? Feeling like there's no threat, there's no consequences, that forget the authority. Yes, that's what I just said. Forget the fact that there's any type of authority. And so what's happening here is that he's sleeping there to protect his grain, right? He's sleeping there in case anyone is going to come and steal from the things that he has made. And so he sleeps at the threshing floor to guard his crop. Here it says that after he eats and he drinks, that his heart was cheerful. A lot of times people will misuse this and just exclaim that he was drunk, but that's not what is happening here. His heart being cheerful or merry, it means to be pleasing, to be well, to be glad. Obviously we know this, but it simply describes someone who's in a good mood, right? Did you know that you can be in a good mood and you can have fun without being intoxicated?
What?
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, every Wednesday.
Yeah, right, we do it every Wednesday and Sunday and hopefully every other day, Like, you can have a good time without substances, without alcohol, right? And honestly, when we see, I know when my wife and I talk about this, we know that sometimes people fall into that deception because it really is a deception, and they think they need it to be happy. And what we find out, I mean, it's just like any other sin. When we dive into it, it brings that euphoria, that high, right? But what happens? There's always a crash, right? And it's not just a crash like a physical crash. That can happen too, right? Obviously, there's consequences to when you drink too much, and you know. But there's also a spiritual crash, right? It brings shame, it brings regret, it brings depression and bitterness and anger and everything that the consequences of sin brings. And what we try to do as human beings is we try to get rid of that horrible feeling because nobody likes it, right? We try to get rid of it by doing the same exact thing that we've done before to cover it up, to mask it, to numb it, right? And so we learn that, you know, it's this horrible cycle that sin allows us to be in, but God frees us from that, He redeems us from that, right? It's a beautiful, wonderful thing. And so we find that we can have this joy, we can have this high, we can have this pleasure in the Lord without the consequences of sin. You know, I really want to encourage you with that because it's a downfall for many people, especially young people, when you leave your homes and now you've been given this great responsibility to make your own choices. You go to college, you hang out with friends, you know, they obviously offer you beer, or beer is there, or alcohol, whatever it is, whatever type of alcohol, it's offered, it's there, it's available. Now nobody's there to tell you you can't drink that or you shouldn't drink that. Now it's your responsibility whether you are going to say no or yes. And what you learn, what you find out, I hope that you understand at some point, if not now, later, that you don't need that to be joyful. You don't need that to be happy. You don't need that to have fun. And I can honestly say that knowing without having ever tried it. Right? I have the joy of the Lord. Like other things bring me joy that don't have consequences that sin does. And so this is not what this means. He's not drunk, right? He's just simply in a good mood. He's worked hard all day. You know when you put in a good day of work? Maybe you don't, I don't know. Some of you do. I know you do. I know a lot of you are hard workers. You put in a hard day of work, you know, it's been good. He's just had a good meal, right? He just got done eating and drinking. He's in a good mood, right? He's happy. And so he lays down, right? He lays down, and here she comes in, and nothing immoral is happening here. There's no innuendo to this. There's nothing to read between the lines. Exactly what is said is exactly what happens for a specific intent. And the intent is not an immoral thing that we oftentimes read into this text. So nothing impure happens here. She's simply, literally taking the covers off of his feet and then lying down near his feet next to the bed. And part of the intent here is exposing, like the physical intent is to expose his feet, because when your feet are exposed, what generally happens when you're sleeping and your feet are exposed? What do you think?
You wake up.
They get cold. They get cold and you may wake up. That's the intent here. Right? That is the physical intent. There's a greater intent that's going to parallel this, but part of it is just to wake him up. Right? Now, I would say this is like pretty scary thing to do. It's a pretty bold thing to do. Right? Not just because of what people will think, but the reason he's here is to protect his crop. Right? So if I'm waking up and somebody's at my feet, like I'm shooting first and then I'm asking questions later, right? Like that would scare me. Like, what's the reason for this? So there is no seduction going on. She's simply taking the covers off his feet so he wakes up, and she's making a statement that she's interested. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. In verse 8, now it happened at midnight. I don't know how long this went on. I don't know how long his feet were uncovered, how long she was there, but it was till midnight, so we safe to say he probably didn't go to bed till 8 at the earliest. So it's a couple hours, couple minutes, I don't know, but he was startled. And he turned himself, and there a woman was lying at his feet. To be startled just means to be afraid. Obviously you know that. To be terrified. And I don't know about you, but I could relate to that. I think you will relate to that as you become parents. It is the funniest and scariest and weirdest, and like, I don't know if you've ever been woken up out of a deep sleep and it takes you like a good 30 seconds to process like what day it is and where you are and what's happening. And so this is what happens as a parent, okay? It's the most freakiest thing ever. Our kids will literally come in our room. There have been times, this isn't every time, they will come in our room, she's laughing because it's hilarious. They will come in our room and they'll just stand over us and stare at us. It'll be like 2 o'clock in the morning and they won't say anything. They won't touch us. And like our subconscious like just knows that something's hovering over us. And we'll wake up and we'll see him and it's just so startling. Like, oh my goodness, yeah. And they're just like, then I'm like, dude, how long have you been there? And he doesn't understand the concept of time, so it's probably been like an hour. But it's the craziest thing. And so I can only imagine, and obviously here's this grown woman who's now sleeping and sitting at his feet. Startled, he jumps up, right? He's scared, he turns himself over, and he says, who are you? I'm sure, again, like, it's in the middle of the night, he's trying to understand what's happening, his brain's trying to process it, but at the same time, his eyes are trying to adjust to the darkness, doesn't fully see and understand who this woman is at this point. And so she answers him, she says, I'm Ruth. I'm your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative. And so Naomi gave her instruction, right? She gave her instruction, but not every single detail of what she should do, especially what she should say. Right? So she says, look, I'm your maidservant. Take me under your wing, for you are a close relative. And her answer here it's interesting because she first starts off by exclaiming that she's his maidservant. And again, this just shows the great humility that this woman has. Right? That she expresses to him, look, I'm just your servant, I'm just your maidservant. Here's this submission unto her master and presenting herself, again, as his servant. And so she says, take me under your wing. Now, ladies, this is pretty romantic. I don't know, like, it doesn't sound like it, but this is really romantic. Like, this is that Hallmark, Nicholas Sparks. Is it Nicholas Sparks? I almost said Nicolas Cage. The romantic stuff that's like, that guys think is really cheesy. This is it. Take me under your wing, right? And what she's doing is she's actually mentioning something that Boaz had mentioned to Ruth earlier in chapter 2, verse 12, where he said, the Lord repay your work and full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Remember that. He said, look, it's an amazing thing. Like, you will find, as he points her to God, because he knows that God can provide everything that she needs as a human being, and specifically in the time that she's in, as a widow, as a daughter-in-law, as an outsider, right? As a stranger to the land, because she's from Moab. She's not from Bethlehem. He says, look, you will find in the Lord God of Israel, you will find refuge under his wings. Right? He had heard, as he asked about who she was, but he had heard, that she left everything to follow God. She left her family. She left her false gods in Moab, right? To run to God and to find refuge within him. But now here, she's running to Boaz, because here Boaz is a representative of God. He is the kinsman redeemer, right? He is the kinsman redeemer. And so she's asking Boaz, there's something that happens here. It's in the culture that we don't understand now, but it's in their culture. That there's something that would happen in Israel where they would put like a blanket over someone. And here Ruth is kind of asking him to do that, to cover her with his blanket. So she uncovered his feet with his blanket, and now she wants him to take his blanket and cover her, like to put her under his wings, right? This is what the parallel is. This is what the interpretation of this is so to cover someone with a blanket in ancient Jewish culture showed intent to marry. Again, it's kind of like a proposal, like it's switched. Guys usually the ones that propose. Well, here's Ruth kind of proposing to him that, hey, cover me with your blanket, or cover me with your wings. And so she lies at his feet to be covered by him as a symbol of marriage. Remember, she's making her intent known, but at the same time asking Boaz to marry her. And here's what I love is that Boaz doesn't, run her off, doesn't shoo her away, right? Doesn't treat her as some type of weirdo, but he uses like really tender words, right? He shows his affection for her and blesses her. We're going to see this in a moment. But she says, look, you are our close relative. This goes back to that Hebrew word of a kinsman redeemer. Right? And in the kinsman redeemer, there was two obligations. We've talked about this before, but there's two obligations for the kinsman redeemer. And in this situation, as all the situations, there was two things that it involved, and that was the property and that was the person. Okay, the property we see in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 23 through 25. It says, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. So this is the Lord instructing in regards to the law here when it comes to the kinsman redeemer, that no sale of the property was to be considered permanent because God was considered the real owner. But then we get into verse 24 and it says, and in all the land your possession you shall grant redemption of the land. So basically saying that every time a sale took place, it was under the condition that it could be bought back by the original owner. Right? You might think that's not fair, but it's not like the original owner is taking the land without any compensation. No, they would just buy it back. And then verse 25, it says, if one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold. So if you sold your land to someone outside the family, a kinsman redeemer could buy the land back at any time. So this is what's happening. Part of the process here, the kinsman redeemer, doesn't just involve Ruth, but it really involves Ruth and Naomi and the property that they once had. But again, the second part of this is the actual person, right? The Levitical law in Deuteronomy 25, it talks about if a husband dies, right, having before a baby's born or after a baby's born, well then the husband's brother is to marry the widow, raise the family in the brother's name, right, to keep the family name going. Well, who has died in this situation? Elimelech, right, who is Naomi's ex or previous husband, right, and also the boys. Their boys. And so we're going to see that this is going to take place with Ruth, whose husband died without an heir. And in verse 10 he says, blessed are you of the Lord. Here's these kind, tender words that we see coming from Boaz rather than saying, you weirdo, what are you doing? No, he recognized, like, God, this is a godly man. God has given him wisdom to understand exactly what is transpiring. Even though it's midnight and he was in a deep sleep, his heart was merry, he just ate good food, and he's tired, he worked all day. He says, blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, and that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. When he says that you've shown more kindness at the end than the beginning, what he's saying is that this act of coming in secrecy to the threshing floor to ask him to redeem her or marry her is a greater act of courage and kindness than the first act of her actually leaving her people in Moab, right? Because that was unheard of. She left her people, she left her family, she left her gods to come back with Naomi to Bethlehem. And another part of this act of kindness is that Boaz commends Ruth for not going after or literally devoting herself to younger men. He says, just as you didn't devote yourself to the foreign gods of your homeland, which would have been much more natural and easy for you to do, you didn't devote yourself to younger men, which would have been much more natural and easy for you to do. And so through this statement, we figured out that Boaz must be a little bit older than Ruth, right? Significant enough for him to mention it. Right? We're not talking about a couple years. We're probably talking about, if we had to guesstimate, that Ruth was probably in her 20s and Boaz was probably in his 40s. And so there's a little bit of an age gap here where we thought, remember at the very beginning of this, in chapter 1, that I'm sure Boaz never thought that there would be anything between them because of just this age gap. But here's what's amazing. This is what I love. Guys and girls, listen to this. Boaz considered himself too old and or maybe possibly unattractive to Ruth, and he ruled out the idea of any romance between them. But here where we see something wonderful about Boaz is that he did not force himself upon Ruth as the kinsman redeemer. He could have just said, look, I am the kinsman redeemer. Right? You are mine. It's my responsibility. It's law. Right? He could have played that card. Right? But he didn't. He said he wasn't going to just say there's a woman I want and I have the right to have her. Right? But he was kind. He was kind to her. It also shows something wonderful about Ruth where she based her attraction to Boaz not on image or appearance, but on value, honesty, character, respect. Right? It wasn't about his age. I think sometimes we get, so caught up in things that have no value. Right? And I'm not talking about a weird age, okay? I'm not talking about like something that's unethical, okay? I'm talking about like realistic, where it's ethical. It's not about age, or it's not about height. So many times like guys get ragged on because like they're short, or like girls, like the funny thing, I'm just gonna tell you this. My sister, she always grew up, she's tall. She's tall, and she's like, I'm never gonna marry a guy that's shorter than me. Never. You know what ended up happening?
She's like half her size.
Yeah, he's like 4'13" or something. But you know what?
What?
He's not. He's taller than that. He's taller than that. But he's not taller than her. But you know what? You know what she realized? And a wonderful thing that all of us should realize at some point is that it wasn't about that. It's not about that. When you look for your future spouse, first of all, you look for someone who loves Jesus. And within that, you look at their value, their honesty, their character. Do they show respect? Right? Those are the things, those are the qualities that we should look for in a person. Right? It's not about the things that can't be controlled. Right? The way that God has created us. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe like, I'm never going to marry someone who's like over 6'5". Well, look, if they love Jesus, right, and they respect you and they honor you, they have value and character, well, by all means, that's what matters. And we see this an example here just between their ages. Ruth sees this within him, and Boaz sees it within her. As we see here, as his response in verse 11, he calls her a virtuous woman. He says, now my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request. For all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. I love that. It's not just him who realizes that she's a virtuous woman. Remember, we talked about this last week, how it's important that we understand that sometimes it's easier to know someone's character, not just in what we see, but what everyone sees. Right? Because we're good at being deceptive one-on-one. We can show the romance, we can be kind, we can be loving in certain times and between one another, but it's really important to see how they treat other people, how they act within group settings, what other people see. Now, that's not to say that we should always just take everyone's input for everything. That's not the point here. But the point is that their virtue, their character, the godliness within them should be seen, not just what you see one-on-one, but other people should see it as well. We see this in Song of Solomon in chapter 1, where the virgins see the man that he's good, right? He has character. And so we see the same word of virtue in Proverbs chapter 31, verse 10, when it comes to Solomon describing, the wife, a wonderful woman. He says in verse 10, who can find a virtuous woman, for her price is far above rubies. And a man of God finds that more attractive than anything else. Right? That's more attractive than anything else. Because listen, appearances aren't bad. Is that right? They're not bad. I mean, God's created you that way. It's not a bad thing to be attracted to someone based on their appearance. But we've got to understand that we aren't to be as shallow as the world. That's what we make our decision upon. That's what everything stands upon. That's a make it or break it. No, that's not it. It's the virtue within the woman. It's the valor within the man. That's what makes her and him attractive. Right? And then we see this again in chapter 12, verse 4. It says, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband. The word excellent here is the same as virtue. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but who causes shame is like rottenness in his bones. And this same word, as I mentioned earlier, is used of heroes in the Bible, right? When it comes to men, right? We typically talk of a woman being virtuous, but in the same sense, we talk of men as mighty men of valor. Right? That was a description of the men that were under David and fought with courage and bravery, who followed the Lord and followed the instructions of David. They were considered mighty men of valor. And so Ruth in chapter 2, verse 6, when Boaz asked his worker in the field, his manager of the field, who is this woman that's gleaning out here? He says, that's the young Moabite woman. Right? That's the young Moabite woman, but now she is considered a virtuous woman. And now this is her reputation. This is what people know her for, that she's proved her faithfulness through working hard to the point where everyone saw and knew her integrity. And he goes on to say in verse 12, now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. And this is what I love about him, is that he follows the rules. He follows God's will. Listen, if it's in God's will, I want to encourage you this. If it's in God's will for you to be with a certain person, you can't mess that up. Nobody can stop that. Right? Do we honestly believe that? It goes in line with what Pastor Kevin always says. He's like, you're invincible until God's done with you. Right? Like, you have a purpose in this life, and once that's done, he's going to call you home. But until then, you're invincible. I mean, that's the same logic that we should have when it comes to, if God has saved someone for me as a future spouse, I don't have to force it. Right? I don't have to rush it. I can trust in the Lord, as we're going to see at the end of this section, at the end of this chapter, that I can just trust in the Lord, that if that's his will, he's going to provide it, and he's going to provide it in a perfect time, which is his time. And so Boaz trusts in this process that, look, my heart desires her, but greater than my heart is obeying what God has set forth in his word. And if God desires, if it's his will, well, then these two things will line up. Right? These two things will line up. So he says, look, I am a close relative, but there is someone that's closer than I. He says, stay this night, in verse 13, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good, let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you. As the Lord lives, lie down until morning. So he could not exercise his right here specifically as a kinsman redeemer unless the closer kinsman redeemer relinquished his rights towards Ruth. He wasn't willing to cut corners. He was going to do God's will, God's way. Again, if he knew that it really was of the Lord, then it could be done orderly and in a proper way. And so again, don't try to force things. Don't try to make things happen too quickly. If God is truly within that relationship, or a relationship that you want, then God will make it happen. God will allow it to happen. In verse 14, so she lay at his feet until morning. She arose before one could recognize another. Then he said, do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Now we might be thinking, like, that is sketchy. Like, wow, like, you don't want anybody to know? Like, it's kind of like, hurry, before our parents get home, leave. This isn't what's happening, okay? That's not what's happening. They're not hiding anything. They haven't done anything wrong. Would you agree? They haven't done anything wrong. So what is the purpose of this? Well, it really relates back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 12. Wonderful verse. It says, abstain from all appearances of evil. Now, the word of the Lord tells us to abstain from evil, period. But then we get in Thessalonians that, hey, not just abstaining from evil, but abstain from the appearance of evil. Well, what does that mean? Well, that directly relates to this section right here. Like, look, he was concerned about this appearance of evil. Right? He didn't bring on this situation, but given his situation, he didn't have the ability to avoid the appearance of evil. So what he does is he makes sure that she leaves without anyone noticing, just so there's not rumors being started, there's not gossip being spread of something that did not happen. Right? He didn't want the kinsman, who was closer as well, to learn that Ruth was now demanding her right to marriage to a kinsman redeemer before Boaz could actually tell this man in person, because he was going to deal with it the next day. So he wants to abstain from all appearance of evil. I'll give you a good example that I have to myself be mindful of. I love root beer. Right? I love root beer. It's like probably my favorite soda. The thing about root beer is that it comes in a brown bottle sometimes. Right? And sometimes I'll get in the car and I'll drive with it, and then I realize I can't do that. I can't drive in the car and drink a bottle of root beer, because what does it look like? It looks like alcohol, right? Some type of beer, because here's this slim glass bottle that looks like all the other alcohol. And so I'm like, look, I don't want to be driving, and then a cop drives by and is like, is that guy drinking alcohol? I'm like, no, it's just root beer, right? But it's the appearance. Right? It's being mindful of the appearance of evil. And so in verse 15 he says, bring the shawl that is on you and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 ephahs of barley, laid it on her, and then she went into the city. And so Boaz, he's such a selfless man. He's always thinking about her. He's always providing and thinking ahead. How can she be provided for? And not just her, but her family. Not just for her, but for Naomi. And so he shows kindness again by providing more of the barley. In verse 16, when she came to her mother-in-law, right, the next morning she comes back. She came to her mother-in-law. She said, is that you, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. And this is not a section or a verse where it's implied that she had no idea if this was Ruth or not. No, but actually what the translation here is getting at when it comes to the original Hebrew is that Naomi is really asking, not, are you like, is this Ruth, but are you still Ruth, the Moabitess, or are you about to be Mrs. Boaz? Right? It's kind of like, show me your hand. Did he give you the ring? Right? Are you engaged? Is this happening? This is what she's asking. So Ruth then goes ahead and tells her all that the man had done. And she said in verse 17, and these 6 ephahs of barley he gave me, for he said to me, do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And so Boaz is reciprocating the intention, right? The message that first Ruth says, I'm interested in you. Here I am, right? Will you marry me? Will you cover me with your wings? And so his message back is showing and revealing to them that he as well is very interested in Ruth. So then she said, as we close, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out, for the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter of this day. You ever been in a situation where you just could not wait for something? Like you could not wait for a result, an answer, and it's just like you're sitting on the edge of your seat, you're pacing back and forth. You know, it can be hard, right? There's a time for action. God calls us to work. God calls us to do things, right? We see the action that Ruth takes in regards to Naomi's advice. She does it. But now, oftentimes, after action, after doing something, there's a time to be patient and to wait. There's a story of a man who rushed into the doctor's office and he shouted, "Doctor, I'm shrinking!" And the doctor calmly responded, "Now settle down. You'll just have to be a little patient." Come back to me in like tomorrow when you figure out how funny that actually is. He said, "Doctor, I'm shrinking," and he says, "You'll just have to be a little patient."
Oh my God. Yo, you guys are all come on, man.
Dude, that's hilarious. Anyways.
Hey, you gotta work on that.
We've got to learn to be patient. Okay? We've got to learn to be patient. Listen. There's times where we work and we do things and we put our hands to the plow. But then there's times where we let go and we let God take care of the rest. Right? We trust in Him and we wait. Psalm 37, 4-7 says this. I'll close here. "Delight yourself also in the Lord, and He shall give you the desires of your heart." I believe this lines up exactly with what we're reading tonight when it comes to Ruth and Boaz. Their desires for one another. But they also put God's will and His desire ahead of theirs. But the Lord promises us here that if we delight ourselves in the Lord, if we follow Him, if we're walking in the Spirit, we're walking in His way and His will, He gives us the desires of our heart because our heart will line up with what He wants for us. In verse 5 it says, "Commit your way to the Lord, trust also in Him, and He shall bring it to pass. He shall bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday." In verse 7 it says, "Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass." I know it's such a hard thing. To wait and to be patient. I think that goes against the very nature of us as Americans. As human beings, first and foremost, but as Americans, where we have been ingrained and it's been taught to us that we want everything now, we want things quickly. I mean, everything. Everything that we invent and do is to do things quicker and faster and easier, right? Isn't that just how we do things? But God's like, no, rest in the Lord and wait patiently on Him. Wait patiently on Him, and He will bless you. And He says, look, again, if you delight yourself in Me, well, I'll give you the desires of your heart. But again, it starts with us delighting in Him, trusting in Him, and following in Him. And so, as we pick up next week, we're going to see how this transpires. Obviously, we spoiled it. You know how it goes. But we're going to see, does the closer kinsman redeemer take advantage and marry Ruth? Or does he relinquish his rights and allow and give the opportunity to Boaz to marry Ruth and take upon that responsibility?